Welcome to Shiver Audiobooks, and thank you so much for joining us today. Before we head into the shadows, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more free stories. Now enjoy A Knife Called Becky.
Chapter 1. The Static in the Study. Detective Max Carter was a man who felt as if he had been carved from a block of old newsprint and marinated in the bitter dregs of yesterday's coffee. At 55, the world had lost its luster. To him, the neon signs of the city were just headaches waiting to happen, and the people he dealt with were usually either victims or the monsters who had made them so. He sat in his unmarked sedan, his fingers drumming a restless, syncopated beat on the steering wheel, watching the rain smear the windshield of the Penhaligon estate into a distorted, gray blur. Another day, another soul gone to ground, Max grumbled to himself. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, bags under his eyes that looked like heavy luggage, and a jawline that had seen better decades. He adjusted his tie, pulled on his worn trench coat, and stepped out into the steady, oppressive drizzle of a Tuesday afternoon. The Penhaligon house was a Victorian relic, a towering structure of dark wood and stained glass that seemed to have thickened like old gravy over the years. Arthur Penhaligon, a widower of 12 years, had been found by his cleaning lady. Max walked through the foyer, his heavy boots echoing on the polished oak floor. He was looking for the why. Most murders had a clear motive: money, sex, or revenge. But as Max entered the study, the why felt strangely absent. Arthur sat in his wing-back chair, facing a cold, soot-stained fireplace. He looked peaceful, almost as if he were contemplating a difficult chess move or waiting for a cup of tea that would never arrive, except for the fact that his throat had been opened with the terrifying precision of a master surgeon. A single clean arc. No jagged edges. No sign of a struggle. Arthur hadn't even stood up. "Find anything, Miller?" his partner, a young, overly eager detective named Sims, asked while snapping photos. The flash of the camera turned the blood-stained study into a series of white-hot snapshots. "Only that our killer is either a ghost or a saint," Max rasped, kneeling by the chair. He looked at the mahogany side table. Arthur's wallet was there, bulging with nearly $400 in cash. A gold pocket watch, an heirloom by the looks of it, ticked rhythmically next to a half-empty glass of sherry. "If this was a robbery, Sims, it's the most incompetent one in history," Max said, his eyes narrowing. "Nothing's gone. Not the silver, not the cash, not even the man's watch. The house was tossed, sure, drawers pulled out, books scattered, but the valuables are still here. It's like they were looking for something specific, something that wasn't money." Max spent the next month obsessing over the vacuum of evidence. He checked every lead, interviewed the few neighbors who still spoke to one another, and looked into Arthur's hobby: metal detecting. Arthur had spent his weekends alone in the deep woods, hunting for the treasures the earth had hidden. "Closer, Max," the captain had said weeks later, leaning against the doorframe of Max's cramped, smoke-filled office. "It's a random act. A drifter, a lunatic passing through. We can't keep a task force on a case with zero DNA and zero motive." Max had stared at the file, the red unsolved stamp hovering in his hand like a heavy hammer. He hated that word. It felt like a personal insult to his 30 years of service. He eventually slammed the folder shut, but in the back of his mind, the silence of Arthur's study continued to hum like static on a dead radio frequency. He didn't know then that the case hadn't ended. It was just waiting for the next hand to reach into the dirt. Chapter 2. The Madness in the Bullpen. The atmosphere at the precinct was usually a predictable cacophony of ringing phones, the rhythmic clacking of keyboards, and the low-level grumbling of officers drowning in paperwork. But on that Friday afternoon, exactly 6 months after the unsolved death of Arthur Penhaligon, the humidity in the room seemed to change. It was that sudden drop in atmospheric pressure you feel just before a tornado touches down, a heavy, static charge that made the hair on Max's arms stand at attention. Max was hunched over his desk, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea he had forgotten hours ago. He looked up and saw Detective Sarah Jenkins standing by the water cooler. Sarah was the unofficial heart of the precinct. She was 32, recently engaged, and possessed a rare gift for getting even most hardened criminals to talk just by offering a warm smile. But the woman standing there now was not the Sarah Max knew. She stood perfectly upright, her spine unnaturally stiff, staring at the glass door of the captain's office. Her pupils were so dilated they had swallowed the brown of her irises entirely, two ink-black voids that seemed to absorb every bit of light in the room. "Sarah, you okay, kid?" Max asked. His voice sounded strangely thin in the sudden silence that had fallen over the bullpen. She didn't blink. She gave no sign that she had heard him. With a slow, almost ceremonial movement, she reached for the back of her belt. Max expected her to draw her service weapon, but what emerged was a knife. It was a rustic-looking thing, a sturdy wooden handle and a carbon steel blade that caught the fluorescent light like a predatory flash. "Sarah, put the knife down," Max said, standing up slowly and spreading his hands in a calming gesture. "Let's just talk. What's going on?" Suddenly, a sound escaped Sarah's throat that would haunt Max for the rest of his days. It wasn't a human scream. It was a rhythmic, guttural hiss, like high-pressure steam escaping a cracked pipe. She lunged, but she didn't run like a normal person. She moved with a jerky, impossible fluidity, like a marionette being operated by a drunken puppeteer. Before anyone could react, she was upon Sergeant DeWitt. With a brutal, mechanical speed, she slashed out. The knife tore through the thick fabric of his uniform as if it were tissue paper, leaving a deep, crimson gash from his shoulder to his elbow. DeWitt cried out in shock and pain, collapsing against a filing cabinet. "Sarah, stop. Now!" Max roared, finally drawing his own weapon. She spun toward Max. Her face was a mask of sweating agony, as if she were screaming on the inside while her body was being piloted against her will. She leaped over a desk with a feline grace, the knife held high above her head. The tip of the blade vibrated in the air, a nervous, hungry tremor. In the chaos that followed, 2 shots rang out. Sims, Max's young partner, had fired from the other side of the room. Max watched Sarah hit the floor. He ran to her side, sliding on the linoleum that was already slick with blood. He grabbed her hand as the last sparks of life retreated from her eyes. The darkness in her pupils finally began to recede, and for a fraction of a second, the real Sarah looked back at him. I couldn't stop her, Max," she whispered, a thin trail of blood escaping the corner of her mouth. "The mist, she has a name." Her head slumped to the side. She was dead before she could finish the thought. Max looked at the knife that had slid from her fingers. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and carefully lifted the weapon. The wood of the handle was smooth, polished by decades of use. He turned it over in the light and saw the letters carved deep into the grain. It was a name hand-etched by someone who had taken their time to make every letter count. Becky. Max Carter felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the precinct's air conditioning. He knew with a sickening certainty that this was the same knife he had seen in the crime scene photos of the Penhaligon murder. But how could a knife that belonged in a sealed evidence bag in a secure locker be here on the floor, wet with the blood of his colleague? Chapter 3. The Son's Burden. The months following Sarah Jenkins' death hung over the precinct like a shroud of gray smoke. The official report called it a sudden psychotic episode brought on by acute occupational stress, but Max Carter knew better. He had seen that knife. He had seen the name Becky etched into the wood. And he knew, deep in his gut, that knives don't just vanish from high-security evidence lockers, unless they don't want to be kept. It was a stagnant Friday afternoon, the sun beating relentlessly against the grime-streaked window of Max's office, when David Penhaligon walked in. David was the son of the murdered widower, and he looked like a man who hadn't experienced a restful hour of sleep in half a year. His clothes hung loose on his narrow frame, and his eyes were hollowed out by dark, bruised circles. He shifted uncomfortably on the wooden chair across from Max's desk, his fingers nervously picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "I've come for my father's things, Detective," David said, his voice a dry rattle. "The lawyer said the case is officially cold. I want to bring the last of his life back home." Max felt a strange, leaden reluctance as he filled out the release forms. He led David down to the basement storage, where a cardboard box sat on a cold metal shelf, waiting like a dormant animal. The box looked innocent enough, but Max's stomach did a slow, sickening flip as he handed it over to the young man. "Your father was a unique man, David," Max said, trying to soften his usually gruff tone. "He loved pulling history out of the dirt with that metal detector of his. He told me just before he died that he'd found his greatest treasure. Something the Earth had been hiding for a very long time." David nodded vacantly. He was obsessed with it. Those last few days he was different. Quiet. Distant. He said he'd found something that breathed. David gripped the box tightly. "Thank you, Detective, for everything." Max watched him leave the precinct. He watched as David walked to his car and placed the box on the passenger seat with a tenderness that felt misplaced. On the drive home, David's attention was repeatedly pulled toward the box. A soft vibration seemed to emanate from it, a rhythmic hum that sat just beneath the threshold of hearing but vibrated in his very teeth. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but the urge to see what lay inside grew into a physical ache in his chest. At a deserted gas station along the highway, he finally pulled over. His heart was hammering against his ribs. With trembling fingers, he tore the packing tape from the box. On top lay some yellowed papers, a stack of old photos of his mother, and a jangling set of keys. But beneath those, wrapped in a piece of tattered navy blue velvet, lay the knife. He recognized it instantly. His father had shown it to him with pride a week before the tragedy. It looked as if it had been forged only yesterday. Not a speck of rust marred the steel. The wooden handle was lustrous and smooth. David reached out and picked it up. The moment his skin touched the wood, it happened. An icy, dark mist slid into his thoughts. It felt like black ink being poured into a glass of crystal-clear water. He saw flashes of images that weren't his, moonlight glinting on a sharpened edge, the sound of breaking glass, and an overwhelming, predatory hunger. It wasn't a hunger for food, but a hunger for recognition. In a fit of terror, David dropped the knife. It landed with a dull thud on the paperwork. He gasped for air, his windshield fogging up from his frantic, shallow breathing. He slammed the box shut, started the engine, and tore out of the gas station with tires screaming. That night, sleep was an impossibility. He lay in his dark bedroom, staring at the ceiling, but in his mind's eye, he saw only that blade. He tried to resist the pull, telling himself it was just the trauma of his father's memory. But the call was irresistible. It felt like an invisible wire was hooked into his heart, reeling him down toward the garage where he had stashed the box. At 3 a.m, he broke. He walked on bare feet across the cold kitchen floor. He didn't turn on the light. He knelt by the box and opened it. There lay the knife in the weak silver glow of a street lamp filtering through the high garage window. It was as if Becky was looking at him with love. He heard no words, but he felt the intent in his very soul. "I love you, David. I've been waiting for you." He picked the knife up again, and this time he didn't fight the mist. He let the darkness in, allowing it to colonize his thoughts until his own personality retreated into the background like a fading echo. David Penhaligon was no longer in the room. There was only Becky, and Becky had work to do. Chapter 4: The Symbiont and the Shadow. The mist was no longer a foreign invader. It had become a shroud, a secondary skin that softened the sharp edges of David's conscience until they were smooth and painless. Standing there in the damp chill of the garage, he felt a profound transformation vibrating through his bones. His movements became compact, his senses preternaturally sharp. The scent of the night air, the distant cry of a nocturnal bird, even the soft, rhythmic ticking of his car's cooling engine, everything arrived in his mind with a crystalline, terrifying intensity. Becky sat in his palm, like a natural extension of his nervous system. The oak handle felt warm, almost feverish, and he could have sworn he felt the grain of the wood pulsing against his thumb, mimicking a heartbeat. That first night, the garage couldn't hold him. David stepped out into the street, his head lowered beneath the hood of a dark sweatshirt. He didn't walk like a man taking a stroll. He glided through the shadows, his feet making no more sound on the asphalt than a falling leaf. He felt no fear, no hesitation. The only emotion remaining was a burning, white-hot desire to fulfill the promise he had made to the steel in his hand. His first victim was a night watchman at a nearby industrial yard, a man who had the misfortune of stepping out for a cigarette at the wrong moment. David moved with a speed he had never known he possessed. It wasn't an act of clumsy violence, it was an act of grace. Becky sang as she sliced through the air. A single, silent movement later, the man collapsed into the gravel. David stood over him for a moment, feeling not horror, but a bizarre, intoxicating satisfaction that seemed to radiate directly from the knife. The days that followed were a blurred montage of blood and silence. During the light of day, David went to his job, but he was nothing more than a hollowed-out shell. He spoke in monosyllables, ate almost nothing, and his colleagues began to whisper about the strange, glazed look in his eyes. He looked like a man who was already half submerged in water. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the shelf filled with a dark, predatory light. The murders followed one another with a sickening momentum. A lonely jogger in the park, a homeless man seeking shelter under the bridge, a young woman walking home from a late shift. The newspapers began to scream about the shadow killer. There was no pattern to the victims, no theft, only that single, disturbingly precise incision that had become a signature. Back at the precinct, Max Carter sat before a wall covered in crime scene photos. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. The grumpy, cynical detective had been replaced by a man possessed. He saw the patterns that the forensic teams missed, the exact angle of the entries, the total absence of struggle, the impossible speed of the strikes. He thought back to the afternoon Sarah Jenkins died. He thought back to the heavy cardboard box he had handed to David Penhaligon. Max knew. He knew he had released something into the city that should have stayed buried in the dark earth of the forest. While the city shivered under the reign of the invisible killer, David sat in his darkened living room, the knife resting in his lap. He polished the blade with a silk cloth, though not a single speck of blood ever remained on its surface. Becky stayed clean. Becky stayed hungry. "Just one more," David whispered, and his own voice sounded foreign to him. It was a soft, sissing tone, more like the sound of a blade being honed on a whetstone than a human throat. In the distance, he heard the low, mournful howl of a police siren. He smiled. He knew Max Carter was looking for him. And deep down, he knew that Becky was looking for Max, too. The detective was the only one who truly understood her power, and that made him the ultimate prize. Chapter 5: The Predator and the Prey. Max Carter didn't bother with the sirens. He knew the man he was hunting wouldn't be spooked by noise, he'd be summoned by it. He drove through the rain-slicked streets of the suburbs, his hands gripped so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles were white as bone. He had bypassed the captain, ignored the frantic calls from Sims, and left his badge on his desk. This wasn't a police matter anymore. This was a debt. He had handed the box to David. He had effectively handed the knife to a man whose soul was already thinned by grief. He pulled up to the Penhaligon house. It stood like a dark tooth against the gray sky. No lights flickered in the windows, but the front door was hanging open, a silent invitation that smelled of iron and wet earth. Max stepped out of the car, drawing his service weapon. His heart was a heavy, irregular drum in his chest. As he crossed the threshold, the air inside felt different, thick, cold, and vibrating with that same static charge he had felt the day Sarah Jenkins died. "David," Max called out. His voice was steady, but sounded small in the oppressive gloom. He followed a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the kitchen. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of steel on stone. Max rounded the corner, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. David was sitting at the wooden kitchen table. He looked skeletal, his skin pulled tight over his cheekbones, his eyes recessed into deep, shadowy pits. He was holding a whetstone in one hand and Becky in the other. "She's been expecting you, Max," David said. His voice was no longer a rattle. It was a hiss that seemed to come from the blade itself. "Put it down, David," Max said, leveling his gun. "I don't want to do this." "You don't understand," David whispered, looking at the blade with a terrifying, tender devotion. "She doesn't want to be put down. She wants to be held. She told me about you. She said you were the one who almost broke her back at the precinct. She respects you. That's why she saved you for last." In a blur of motion that defied the laws of physics, David didn't just stand up, he launched. He moved with the jerky, marionette grace of the possessed. Max fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the room for a split second, but the bullet hit the wall behind David. The boy was gone, a shadow dancing on the edge of the light. A searing pain flared in Max's shoulder. He hadn't even seen the strike. He spun around, firing again, but he was swinging at air. Becky was singing now, a high-pitched, metallic hum that vibrated in Max's skull, muddling his thoughts, filling his mind with that same dark, oily mist. "She's in your head, isn't she, Max?" David's voice came from the darkness behind the refrigerator. "Can you feel her? The cold? The hunger?" Max slumped against the counter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel it, the urge to drop the gun, to reach out and touch the beautiful, gleaming steel. He wanted to feel the grain of the oak. He wanted to know why Sarah had died for it. "No!" Max roared, biting his tongue until the copper taste of his own blood snapped the fog. David lunged again, this time aiming for the throat. Max didn't use the gun. He used his weight. He tackled David midair, and the two of them crashed onto the linoleum floor. They struggled in the dark, a frantic scramble of limbs and heavy breathing. Max gripped David's wrist, keeping the vibrating blade inches from his eyes. The name Becky glowed in the dark, the carved letters pulsing with a faint, sickly light. Suddenly, David's body went limp. The frantic energy vanished. He looked up at Max, his eyes momentarily clear, filled with a sudden, agonizing clarity. "I can't keep her out," David gasped. "Please, Max, don't let her find someone else." With a strength that came from a place of pure desperation, David wrenched his arm free. But he didn't strike Max. He turned the blade toward his own chest. "I love you, Becky," he whispered. The knife slid into his heart as if his ribs were made of water. There was no blood. Instead, a thick, black smoke erupted from the wound, a viscous shadow that curled around Max's throat before dissipating into the ceiling. David Penhaligon shriveled before Max's eyes, his body becoming a dry, gray husk in a matter of seconds. The knife clattered to the floor. The silence that followed was the heaviest Max had ever heard. Chapter 6. The Silence of the Earth. Max Carter didn't report the body. He didn't call for a forensic team. He knew what would happen if Becky was logged into evidence again. Some young clerk would see the shine of the blade. Some curious officer would touch the handle. The cycle was a circle, and Max was the only one left to break it. He wrapped the knife in a lead-lined sheet he had scavenged from an old X-ray room. He didn't touch the wood. Even through the heavy gloves, he could feel the blade thrumming, a resentful, captive heartbeat. He drove for 6 hours, far beyond the city limits, deep into a forest where the trees were so old they seemed to remember the beginning of time. He hiked for miles into the dense undergrowth, far from any trail, until his knees screamed and his breath was a ragged fire in his chest. He dug a hole 5 feet deep, his hands bleeding through his gloves. He threw the lead-wrapped bundle into the dark earth. "Stay there," Max rasped, his voice a broken ghost of itself. "Stay in the dark where you belong." He filled the grave, tamping down the dirt and covering it with heavy stones and rotting leaves until the forest looked as if it had never been touched. Max Carter retired the next day. He sold his car, burned his files, and moved to a small town in the middle of a desert where the ground was too hard for anything to grow and there wasn't a forest for 1,000 miles. He spent the rest of his days sitting on a porch, staring at the horizon, waiting for a sound he hoped he would never hear again. But deep in the forest, beneath 5 feet of heavy clay and the roots of an ancient pine, the lead began to thin. The wood of the handle didn't rot. The steel didn't rust. Becky lay in the dark, her blade sharp, her name etched in the grain. She didn't mind the wait. She knew that eventually a hiker would lose their way. She knew that a hobbyist with a metal detector would hear a faint, metallic hum beneath the soil. She was patient. After all, the earth is full of secrets, and Becky always got the last word.
Thank you for listening to A Knife Called Becky. This story was brought to you by Shiver Audiobooks. If this tale of shadows and steel kept you on the edge of your seat, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep these mysteries coming. And please don't forget to check out our playlist for more thrilling stories. See you in the next one.